right, thank you all for coming today. We're going by satellite. We think it's about 8:30. Is it?
Just about.
Okay.
Still 8:29.
All right, good. Well, thank you all for skipping the immigration issues that are ongoing, and it's an important time for all of us for many reasons, but we're also still interested in public health questions as well as what's around us because it's very related. So this morning we have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Pam Marcus, and Dr. Marcus is at the National Cancer Institute. I'll give you a little background. She told me she could also give some background too. So she did her bachelor's degree in math and then went on and did a master's degree in statistics and another master's in preventive medicine at University of Wisconsin. At University of Wisconsin, she worked with Dave Demetz, who many of you know, and he hooked her up with Polly Newcomb, with whom she started working at University of Wisconsin. And then she went to NCI.
UNC.
Oh, sorry. I'm forgetting the PhD. Then she went to UNC to do her PhD, and her advisor was Beth Newman, and she remembers her PhD thesis. I'm not sure I can remember mine, but it was adolescent exposures and breast cancer risks. So still an apropos question. It's amazing how slow knowledge accumulates. So then, after that, she went to NCI after her PhD at UNC, where she was a cancer prevention fellow, and then her current job. But she'll talk about an intervening job, actually, I think, and what she did there. So now she's in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Science in the Epi and Genomics research program. And she reminded me, as a clinical trialist, that this is the largest funder of cancer research cancer epi
research
in the world, not counting clinical trials. So it really is epidemiology. And I reminded her that evidence synthesis is epidemiology and observational studies. So anyway, I think it's, but she also has worked with clinical trials, and that's what she's going to talk about today.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I've gotten to the point in my career where my favorite thing to do is to talk with students and young researchers, so it's a real treat to be here. So the title of my talk today is Streamlining Clinical Trials, Reflections on the Operations in the National Lung Screening Trial. And I'm here because I got this email from Kay last August that said, "Dear Dr. Marcus." I'm like, oh Lord, nobody calls me that. But I had taken a class with Kay at SCT anyway. I read your paper on evaluation of death review, and it's just the right thing for our clinical trials seminar. Would you come and speak? And I got all excited because nobody ever asks me to talk about methods and operations of clinical trials. And I loved doing it. To me, it was a puzzle. Like, how could you pull off these unbelievably complex things and all sorts of questions, problems to solve? So I think, like, the tone of my email was hooray in like 60 font with like 1 million exclamation points. So it's really fun to be talking about this. So anyway, today's talk, why streamline clinical trials? You probably know the answer to this already, but I'll give you my thoughts on it. I've worked on 2 large clinical trials of cancer, assessment of cancer screening modalities. I worked on these while I was in the Division of Cancer Prevention, which was before my current division at NCI, but we did run clinical trials at that point in that division. There's one that's starting up called TMIST. You may hear about it, the tomosynthesis, but I won't be talking about that. So the question that I'm going to, or the analysis I'm going to present is, could we have streamlined our endpoint verification process in NLST, and then some closing thoughts. So why streamline clinical trials? We've got a spectrum. It's very simplistic, but you've got the small, short, and simple, the big, long, and complex, and the everything in between. Cancer screening trials fall on that big, long, complex part of the spectrum. They're big because cancer is a relatively rare disease, and the definitive outcome, cancer-specific mortality, actually what I should say is cancer site-specific mortality is even more rare. So if you're assessing a breast cancer modality, your outcome is death due to breast cancer. They're long. The natural history of cancer is not well understood. It's assumed to be variable, but it's a decades-long process in most instances. And they're complex because it's not like you're just collecting information on patients and how long they live after being given a drug. First, you have to identify them for eligibility, then you have to screen them, collect information on how the positive screens were worked up, diagnostic evaluation, if they're diagnosed with cancer, their diagnosis, their treatment, and then track them for death. So the bottom line here is that you may not need to streamline the short, small, simple ones, but streamlining big, long, and complex trials is probably a necessity in today's world. And why do we need to do that? Well, in general, money is tight, and people are impatient. Nobody wants to wait for anything. Specific to cancer screening trials, because the trials are long, you will often find that during the course of a trial, there are rapid changes in technology. There's often premature dissemination, so contamination. If your control group wants to go out and get what the intervention is getting, it's often easy for them to do that. We've got the media, now we've got the internet, so people are learning about these things faster than they did before there was the internet. And I think there's also the emotion surrounding a cancer diagnosis and screening. The common perspective is that, of course, screening saves lives. Why are you wasting time doing this trial? We already know the answer. So I want to tell you about my experience with cancer screening RCTs. So I've worked on the two, PLCO and NLST, and I spent 10 plus years, I say running in quotes because nobody runs things by themselves, but I was part of a bigger machine that made this happen. So I quickly realized that I was very interested in field operations. And so what exactly did I do? So PLCO came first, and I was the NCI lead for the Methods and Operations Committee, and that's not statistical methods. I'm not sure why we have the word methods in there, but really operations. So I worked a lot with the screening center coordinators and the coordinating center to address, solve issues on operations and publish topics on methods and operations. So NLST started a couple of years after I started on PLCO. We did a feasibility study first, but I had a much bigger role in NLST and was the lead epidemiologist for the NCI component of the trial. More about that later. I was involved and took the lead in many of these areas: protocol development, implementation, site visits, forms development, death review development. But basically, I saw my role as doing whatever needed to be done to make the thing work. And I love that. I really love that. So just a little background. So PLCO, 92 to 2009, about 150,000 volunteers, 10 men and women, 10 screening centers. We had a coordinating center and a statistical programming center. It was funded through a contract mechanism. I'll get back to that. Just remember that. So PLCO, prostate, lung, colorectal, and ovarian cancer. I see some of you are taking notes. I'll give Kay the slides, so you don't need to feel like you have to get everything down. And you can see, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about PLCO, but you can see what the regimens were. Actually started as the P trial, just prostate, and then and this was in the 80s, when the concept was being developed. And somebody said, well, if we're bringing these men in for prostate screening, how about we bring them in? How about we also give them chest x-ray for lung cancer? Let's, finally address that question in a definitive manner. And let's give them flexible sigmoidoscopy, because if this was the 1980s, that's what people were doing, late 1980s. And then somebody noticed something. Anybody know what that something was?
It was only men.
It was only men. Now, if it was just prostate, that would have been okay. But the minute you bring men in to have exams that are applicable to women as well, you can't just do it in men. So plan got stopped. They added ovarian cancer screening. So prostate, you may be familiar with this, but no reduction in prostate cancer mortality. The frequently cited flaw as to why there was no observed benefit, as if we know there is, was that there was contamination in the control arm. Again, it's the dissemination of technology and people in the control arm being able to get it. Lung, no reduction in lung cancer mortality, but relevance to NLST. I'm talking about PLCO because you're going to see how if there hadn't been PLCO, NLST would not have been, would have taken a lot longer. So part of the idea of streamlining is learning and building from what you've done before. So that's why I'm going into this. So colorectal cancer, reduction in colorectal cancer mortality, and this is flex sig. So just the left side, but still an overall reduction for the whole colon and the rectum. The distal, the left-sided, which is in reach of the sigmoidoscope, the reduction was greater, as one would expect. But while PLCO was going on, colonoscopy creeped in, and Medicare started covering it, so that that I don't want to say posed challenges, but that was an issue. Ovarian cancer, no reduction in lung cancer mortality, no reduction in ovarian cancer mortality. It was powered for a 35% reduction, which is an unlikely benefit. So NLST. So we started NLST, the trial itself, not the feasibility phase, 2002 to 2010. We were still writing papers. Well, people are still writing papers, but the trial was stopped in October of 2010. 53,000 healthy volunteers. They were heavy smokers, so that's why healthy is in quotes, but they had to have not had things that were suggestive of them having lung cancer, like coughing up blood, on supplemental oxygen. Ages 55 to 74, men and women. So there was a minimum smoking amount required, at least 30 pack years. And if they were a former smoker, they must have quit within 15 years of randomization. And the participants were randomized to either annual computed tomography. Does everybody know what CT is? Everybody heard of CT? So it's just the cross-sectional 3D version of chest X-ray. So that was the intervention. The control arm got annual chest X-ray, okay? And for 3 rounds of screening. Now, PLCO was in progress when NLST started. So the question of chest X-ray was unanswered at that point. So we used chest X-ray. Why did we use chest X-ray? Any thoughts?
Is it standard of care?
So we've got 1 vote for standard of care.
Non-invasive, you don't have to give any media or anything.
Non-invasive. I want you to think more like clinical trials methodologists. Take 1 more and then I will reveal the secret.
Is it easy to standardize? I don't know how easy it is to standardize.
So we chose chest X-ray because if PLCO had found a benefit of chest X-ray, and if we had used usual care, so nothing, as the control arm in NLST, then NLST would have been useless. So that, a lot of people were not comfortable with that, but ultimately PLCO did not find a benefit. We've done some analyses to look at the mortality rate in the NLST eligible component of PLCO, and the result was exactly the same. So that worked out, thank God. So NLST was actually a collaboration between NCI and the American College of Radiology Imaging Network, which I'll refer to, and which is often called the ACRIN. The trial was harmonized on major protocol components. And the first thing about streamlining that I can tell you is that this collaboration did not streamline operations. It was an arranged marriage. So the NCI component, sometimes we call it the lung screening study, enrolled 35,000 of the participants. We used the 10 PLCO centers at the same coordinating center, same statistical programming center. We built on what was already there. Again, through a contract mechanism, I'll get to that in a second. The ACRIN component, 19,000 participants, 23 centers. They had a joint statistical and coordinating center, and they did it using a cooperative agreement mechanism. So what's the difference, and why does it matter? Contract, the government is in charge, as if you didn't know that already, determines all scientific aspects and then owns the data when it's done. The screening centers, the institutions have clear deliverables. They are required to administer the exams, to follow up the participants, collect the data, and hand it over. And compare this to an R01, a typical grant where the deliverable is just science. So a cooperative group is a grant. It's a U10 mechanism. There's substantial involvement of government program and administrative officials due to special need or expertise. Once again, the deliverable is science because this is a grant. This is my least favorite grant mechanism because when I worked on one of these, it's responsibility without authority. So NLST results, reduction in lung cancer mortality, 20%, statistically significant. For the first time, a cancer screening trial actually showed a reduction in all-cause mortality. It was about 7%, again, statistically significant. It was driven by the large number of lung cancer deaths. If you pulled the lung cancer deaths out and looked at non-lung cancer mortality, the statistical significance went away. So why did I mention PLCO? So NLST could not have been completed as quickly or as smoothly without the experience of PLCO. Most people who worked on the NCI part of NLST were also working or had worked on PLCO. And Akron benefited from those experiences as well. And if you're interested in papers on methods and operations, we've published more than the typical clinical trial, and when I got fed up with the fact that a lot of journals wouldn't take these because they don't get cited, we did a monograph. And it's in an obscure journal, but I don't care. The stuff got published. People who want it can have it, can get to it. So back to streamlining in NLST. So I've already told you about two administrative aspects that could have been streamlined. The arranged marriage, it would have been a lot easier to do it if it was just one of the two groups, either of the two groups. And then the whole contract cooperative agreement thing. Anyway, we made it work. I can sit here and shake my head, but you know what? Everybody was so dedicated to making it work that we made it work. The PLCO experience made NLST less of a bumpy ride. That was kind of the best way to say it. But what about scientific streamlining? So you can streamline administratively or you can streamline scientifically. So the question is there anything that we can do or that we could have done to streamline without losing the scientific rigor? Because that's the key. You want to have the scientific rigor, or why bother doing the work? So the example I'm going to give is endpoint ascertainment. So, so the guts of the next part of the talk comes from a presentation that I gave at SCT in 2012. And it came out, we published it last year, and there's the citation if you'd like to look it up. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the cause of death, the primary outcome in cancer screening RCTs is disease-specific mortality. So accurate assignment of cause of death is critical. So, and I have underlying cause of death. I put the definition down there because underlying, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that it's the underlying cause of death is the disease or injury which initiated the train of events leading to death. So, and the next part is accident and violence, and we didn't really have, that wasn't really of concern in this trial. So, but you know, people do commit suicide. I'm sorry, people do, I don't like that phrase. People choose to take their own lives. And there's one paper that suggests that men who have been diagnosed with prostate cancer have elevated rates of suicide. So anyway, so it's the thing that set off the process. So somebody may die of pneumonia, that may be the immediate cause, but if it's because their lungs were riddled with cancer, lung cancer is the underlying cause of death because they would not have had the pneumonia had they not had the lung cancer. So there are two ways to assign cause of death. You can use a mortality review committee, and I will refer to this as death review. It's just easier to say. So it's more resource intensive, but it's thought to be more accurate. You can also use death certificates, which are less resource intensive, but also thought and have been demonstrated to be less accurate. So most cancer screening RCTs have used some form of death review. And, the question in the back of many people's minds is, well, is it really worth the effort? Maybe death certificates are good enough. So Paul Doria Rose and a few others of us looked at death certificates to death review in clinical trial, in some cancer screening trials, and dichotomous. So for example, lung cancer versus not lung cancer. We had 2 lungs, 1 breast, 1 colorectal. And for all of them, the kappa was above 0.80, or at a minimum 0.85, which, as you know, a kappa of 0.5 is considered good. So here was the question at hand. Simply put, did we have to do all that death review work? Could we have gotten the right, or perhaps a better term, the same answer if we had just used information from the death certificates to assign an underlying cause of death? In case you haven't seen a U.S. death certificate, you can find one at that link. I don't know how, I don't have my glasses on, but now I do. So I copied the cause component, and you can see the first line is the immediate cause, so it's that pneumonia. And then there are sequentially list conditions, if any, leading to the cause listed on line A. Enter the underlying cause, death or injury, last. So in other words, you go backwards with the train of events. So let me see if I can come up with a better one than lung cancer. No, I'm not going to use that one. So let's say the immediate cause is sepsis. You go back one step, and it's like the flesh-eating necrosis, something like that. I'm not doing a good job with this. I'm not going to try. You know what I mean. Do you
mean, we did a lot of this in some AIDS study, and it would be like cardiopulmonary collapse or failure.
Right.
It's like, well, okay, their heart and their lungs stopped.
Right.
But then it would be HIV, then it would be PCP pneumonia. I mean, there were kind of like several layers.
That's an excellent example. And then AIDS before that. So you're always looking for the bottom thing. And here are the instructions for filling it out. Always enter the underlying cause of death on the lowest used line. Now, does that happen? Death certificates don't have that good a reputation because the doctors who are filling them out are not filling them out for research purposes. Something to keep in mind. So NLST death review. So what did we do? Well, first we had to determine if somebody had passed. And oftentimes family members would call in, or we'd get mail back that was stamped deceased. But we did also run an NDI National Death Index search annually to see if any of the lost to follow-up participants might be dead. Although those results then were investigated. Get the death certificate. We had medical record abstractors assign codes to the text causes, because like the person who fills out the death certificate doesn't write C39.4. They write what the cancer is. The abstractors took the information and derived the underlying cause of death code. Don't ask me details on this. I tried to look it up last night and didn't get very far. The screening centers collected medical records for events leading up to the death and the death. They had to remove references to the trial study arm. The records were then sent to the reviewers, and then you waited. So who was on our death review committee? We had 5 MDs, including 1 MD epidemiologist. The members were blinded to arm assignment. They thoroughly reviewed the records. They completed a long questionnaire, which, when it was all said and done, they had to check yes or no, was the underlying cause of death lung cancer versus not lung cancer. So, so one important thing to remember, one of the big issues in cancer screening is that you turn healthy people into sick people. So people who go in to get screening exams, when they walk in, they're healthy. And within a few, they have a positive screen. Within a few months, they can have a cancer diagnosis. And there's that thing in medicine, first do no harm. So it's important not only to consider or to count direct deaths due to lung cancer. You also need to count any death that was the result, a downstream effect of being screened. So basically, those should be strikes against screening. So if you take a heavy smoker and see something on a CT, they biopsy it, and then they have to go to thoracotomy. Heavy long-term smokers don't make the best surgical candidates. So a big concern was that the people in the trial, okay, you send them to thoracotomy, but they're going to die on the table because they don't have the cardiac or the pulmonary strength to withstand it. It's those things that you stand to lose without death review, especially with lung cancer screening. So we did not review all deaths. This in itself was streamlining. And this came from the experience in PLCO. So there were certain deaths that you didn't need to review. The deaths we did review were selected by a predetermined algorithm. And in summary, the algorithm chose deaths with any death certificate cause of death, so anywhere on those lines that were most likely to represent a death due to lung cancer, either directly or indirectly, and deaths that might have been erroneously assigned a death certificate lung cancer death. So a number of cancers metastasize to the lungs, and that can, if the person filling out the death certificate doesn't know the whole history, lung cancer could be coded as the underlying cause of death, when in fact it was actually another primary, a different primary. Also, deaths within 6 months of a screen suspicious for lung cancer, try and get those downstream, and 60 days within certain lung cancer diagnostic evaluation procedures. This was the death review process. So it was stepwise. I'm not going to go into it. You can, basically, we had a chair look at them. If the chair disagreed with the death certificate, another member of the committee reviewed it. And if that person also disagreed, it went to the whole committee. And sometimes it came to fisticuffs, but not that often. So I wanted to know, well, what would have happened if we had just used death certificates? So the gold standard in these analyses I'm about to present was death review. The outcome of interest was lung cancer cause of death versus not lung cancer cause of death. I looked at the we looked at the performance characteristics of the death certificate, and we also reran the final interim analysis. And that it hadn't occurred to me to do that, but Tony Miller, who was on the death review committee, said, "Isn't that the bottom line?" I was like, "Oh yeah." So would the use of death certificate data only change the conclusion of this study? So we had 643 deaths. You can see where the concordance and the discordance fell out or shuffled out. It was 94% agreement. The kappa was 87%. So where do you see of the two discordant cells? Okay, this is a really easy question. Which one is bigger? The 84 one. So those were the ones that the death certificate said not lung cancer and death review turned into lung cancer.
Question. These cases were all selected by the algorithm?
Yes.
Okay, so that was already loaded towards lung cancer? Yes.
Yes. Not sure how I want to answer that, but yeah, it was already loaded towards lung cancer. So, all right, now I'm thinking. But anyway, so I'm going to show you what those flipped to, and I would have, well, we'll get to that when we get to that. So the performance characteristics, sensitivity 91%, specificity 98%, positive predictive value 98%. So if your death certificate says that you had lung cancer, it's right nearly all of the time. If it doesn't say the NPV is 89%, I'd like it to be higher. Is it that bad? I don't know. So it appears that the death certificates appear to have missed 9% of lung cancer deaths. And go ahead.
Just the 1643, when you say that's 42% of all deaths, does that mean 58% of them were not adjudicated in this way? So these agreement statistics would be quite a lot higher if you included those.
Right, and I have that on a slide. So that 9% may have been due to the adverse effects of diagnosis or treatment. So the strikes against lung cancer that were not that didn't show up on the death certificate because they wouldn't. So there were 19 lung cancer deaths reassigned to other causes of death. And you can see most of them were other malignancies, respiratory 6, CVD 3, pneumonia, dementia. And I'm not surprised about the other malignancies. I don't know enough about medicine to say anything about the rest of them, but I think nothing jumps out at me here as being untoward. So the 84 non-lung cancer deaths reassigned to lung cancer by death review. 32 other malignancies, which suggests to me that that there may be some misattribution to the primary site on death certificates. 22 CVD, respiratory 13, other 13. I should have those others. Don't apologize for that. Complications of medical or surgical care 3. I really should have looked to see what the others were, but I don't think any of them spoke to a downstream effect of screening, or else I probably would have put it in red flags. And there was one pending at the close of the surgery. So, you know, one of the DSMB members kept saying, your rate of death on the table is too low. More people have to be dying on the table. The table meaning that they couldn't withstand lung surgery. I don't know. I mean, so then when we started the trial, we had a few of what people would call community care centers, and the people who were against doing the trial said, oh, you can't have those in the trial. They don't know what they're doing. So when the trial was over, some people said, well, you used academic medical centers. How do you know this is going to work in the community? So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. LDCT has not disseminated, as far as I can tell, as quickly as anybody thought it was going to. So we don't have data about whether the patients who are getting treatment at community centers are faring worse than the people in NLST. Difference by study arm, I'm going to say not really. So here it is, the final interim analysis. Best available information. That means death review, if it went through death review, death certificate otherwise. This is what was published, 20%. Death certificate only, 18%. Pretty close. Yeah. So, limitations of the analysis, the death review process. So about 75% of deaths with a death certificate cause of death other than lung cancer were not reviewed. And skip down to the second indented bullet. So if these deaths had been reviewed and assigned a cause of death other than lung cancer, so if they were correct, then the specificity would have been 99% as opposed to 98%. The MPV would have been higher. The other thing to remember is that these findings are only generalizable to lung cancer screening and to the people with the characteristics, the eligibility characteristics. So nobody should take these results, walk away and say, oh, we don't ever need to do death review in any cancer screening trial. I'm just going to leave it at that. So what's the conclusion? When assigning lung cancer cause of death among heavy long-term smokers, death certificates provide sufficiently accurate information. But, you know, when I went back to look at that, I was like, that makes me a little uncomfortable. So I have this lingering discomfort. And this is what it is. Would I ever do an RCT and not do some sort of death review? Is that a foolish thing to do? You go through, spend all this money, you go through all this work. Are you not going to do death review? Now, I don't know if I have this, I probably have this on one of the slides, but this is the problem in cancer screening. Well, this is the problem in any clinical trial. If you get the answer that people want, your trial is the best thing since sliced bread. And if you don't, it's wrong, wrong, wrong. You did this wrong. You did that wrong. So after NLST, after we stopped the trial and the results were reported, whoever was the NCI director at that point said in a closed meeting, this is like the best RCT ever done. He may have said cancer screening, I wasn't there. A colleague of mine who was there came back and told me this, and I said, well, you know why he said that? And he said, because we did it really well. I said, absolutely not, because it found a reduction in mortality. And this colleague just said, but he knows the compliance was good. Found a reduction. So anyway, some closing thoughts. So to streamline or not to streamline. So the things to consider. What's the chance that streamlining will give you the wrong answer? And then also, what's the chance that people won't believe your findings if you streamline? And I think the bottom line is, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. You gotta pick and choose where you want to spend your money in these things. So everybody gets like this. We want to collect everything, but each bit comes at a cost, both financial and otherwise. You know, a few weeks ago, I was juggling a million things, and it occurred to me that it is much easier to juggle one ball 10 times in a row than to juggle 10 balls at once. And doing a complex clinical trial is juggling 10 balls at once. There's also the Christmas tree effect. And basically, I can't take credit for this analogy, but you can load lots of ornaments on a Christmas tree, but there is one that's going to topple the whole thing. Don't do so much that it affects everything else. So could we have streamlined other places in NLST? We had this medical history questionnaire. There's pressure from people outside of the trial to include it. We couldn't really put enough effort to make the data very useful. I'm not sure that anybody's used it. Maybe somebody, I don't know, it's really crappy data, I think. And it was a burden to the participants. The thing was not short. There was some data that only Akron chose to collect, quality of life data, smoking cessation, and they've published on that. Medical records for a subset of clinically significant other than lung cancer screening. So what else could CT pick up other than lung cancer? So if they saw something like an aortic calcification, no suspicion for lung cancer, but something else that needed to be addressed clinically, those people were shunted. It got a different code, and they were encouraged to get follow-up for that. So the truth is, would I ever do NLST without some form of, that's missing, death review? And the answer is no. But is there more streamlining that could be done, or let's pretend we do it over? More sampling? That's, that's always the easy answer. But then I started to think, well, maybe you treat it like an interim analysis with a futility boundary. But then you have to make some assumptions that your information is coming in a manner that wouldn't bias it one way or the other. And then I thought, well, maybe you could just collect and store the medical records just in case. Now that would still be a lot of work, but it would not require a committee. It would not require redacting of the medical records to eliminate, trial references. I don't know. So some folks advocate big and simple trials. And what these are, they use an all-cause mortality endpoint rather than disease-specific. And it's not only for cancer screening. I've heard people talk about this. I don't think that would be possible for cancer screening trials. Aside from cancer death is rare. You can barely see an effect on all-cause mortality. Really, NLST, the 7%. Now, this brings up other issues that if the intervention affects the population's health that little, is that where we should be putting our resources? But that's a talk for another day. So that's the end. Thanks for your attention, and be happy to answer any questions. I know we've got about 9 minutes left, according to the official Garmin watch. And then I think we have some free time also from 9:30 to 10 for, if you have a question that you don't want everybody else to hear. But thank you. And please let me know your name.
Hi, I'm Barbara Hawkins, and I wanted to ask if you consider taking a sample of the deaths not selected by your algorithm.
Oh man, yeah, gosh. The first time I did this talk, I thought to myself, how did we miss that? We should have done that. So what Barbara is suggesting is the ones that didn't go to death review, we should have taken a sample to hopefully demonstrate that we didn't miss anything.
Well, at least you could estimate how much you might have missed.
Right, exactly. But I'll tell you, it was the juggling 10 balls in the air. It's like, it didn't even occur to me. Okay?
So I was interested in your early comments about contract versus U10.
Mm-hmm.
I vastly prefer grants.
So I am a big fan of R01s.
I have a U01. So
Okay.
And I've had U10s. And but so I'm wondering about your reasons other than control, which you mentioned. And contracts, for example, at least the ones I have, require umpteen interim reports, which takes our time away from the science. So why do you like them?
Okay, so very, very good question. So as you can see, the challenges and the effort for each of these ways is different for NCI and different for the grantee. I don't like U10s because, not U10s, U01s, I'm sorry. I don't like U01s not because I would just rather, if the grantees want to do their work, if it's a grant, let them do their work. But when I worked on one, I was expected to make everybody get along. I had no responsibility. I had no authority, but I had responsibility. And it drove me up the wall. people were not playing nice in the sandbox. There were a bunch of arranged marriages, and I just didn't, maybe it just wasn't my personality, but there's this tension between the grantees feeling and that they know more than NCI, and NCI feeling, well, we know we have to tell you this, we want to tell you this, we want you to do it this way. I would much prefer to let the grantee, in that situation, let that collaborative network do its own thing. Contracts. So there was no ambiguity, there was no uncertainty about who was in charge with contracts. And because it was a multi-site endeavor, we could guarantee that things were being done uniformly, or as uniformly as possible. I fully understand why extramural investigators hate contracts, scientific contracts. Totally get it. If I was an extramural investigator, I would hate it as well. But I'm not. And I'm speaking as the person on the other side of the fence. And I'm glad you brought that up, Kev. I don't mean any disrespect, but just it made my job easier. Barbara?
Well, my cooperative agreements were with the smaller institute, the National Eye Institute, a number of them. And I found them very useful because I felt like it was a partnership, and I felt like I always had an advocate within the institute, going to council or for whatever purpose that the person was the project officer type person or liaison was always very involved, understood the study thoroughly, even though they hadn't designed the study or whatever. And I particularly like the cooperative agreements more than a grant or than a contract.
Good, that's good to hear.
So it's a different perspective from yours, obviously being inside the institute. So
It may also be that contracts were the first thing that I knew, and the thing that I knew for so much of my career. It may also be that over the years, the degree to which, as the NCI program staff, we get different messages every year, and it seems like it's just getting I don't know, it just seems like the messages are like more stay out, but I don't know, I shouldn't say that. So there's
thank you for the excellent talk. I'm Michael Rosenblum. I was wondering, have people looked at the relationship between the amount of misclassification error in outcomes and power in type 1 error, so you can get a sense roughly before the trial starts? You could use prior trial data, like what you have already, to look at how much measurement error would lead to how much power loss and how much type 1 error. It could push type 1 error maybe in a good direction, but maybe not, so that to get a sense of, look, you could quantify the value of adding this review of the outcome.
Right. So I make sure I understand your question. So when you design a trial, you do power calculations, obviously. And for cancer screening trials, you always account for contamination and compliance. But I'm pretty sure that standard programs don't account for error in outcome assignment. So the question is, well, what about doing that? And it sounds like a good idea. I may have a master's degree in statistics, but I'm no statistician. But it does sound like a really good idea. One thing I should mention is that the nearly all of the PLCO and NLST data are public access. And actually they all are public access, but nearly all are available on the web. You have to put in just a form that says, I want to use it for this. And I've never heard of NCI ever not signing off on it. But if you search on CDAS, which is Cancer Data Access System, and either NLST or PLCO, you will get to the website that will tell you how to get the data and tell you what's available. It's a fantastic website. Because PLCO and because part of NLST were contract mechanisms, the government put a lot of effort into making it easily accessible.
That's great, thank you. It's a great resource as well.
It is a great resource. The other thing is we have other stuff that we've done through contract mechanisms with regard to cancer screening. And if you're interested, just send me an email and I can let you know what we have.
It's great, and it's the same issue that you're saying. It's come up in other trials I've worked on where you have, it's a stroke treatment trial, but it's a modified Rankin scale of disability, and there's a lot of, they think there's a lot of measurement error there, grading between two different levels of disability.
Okay.
Well, I don't want to put her on the spot, but Bobby Scherer's done a study as part of a clinical trial, and she can talk about it more than I, comparing what you get from operative reports compared to an investigator filling out a form about what happens during the operation, which is very much like it. Maybe you can talk about it, because I think, when we streamline trials, we really have to look at these mechanisms. I don't know what you want to say.
Yeah, just that in terms of specific complications that we were looking at, obviously the form was better, but in terms of the detail, there was probably a lot more in the operative notes that we could have actually used in the trial.
Yeah, one thing I didn't point out that probably I should have, the screening exams in both NLST and PLCO were administered as part of the trial. But all the participants got follow-up care through their primary care physicians or their own doctors. So those individuals, with NLST, the screening centers often got calls, well, what am I supposed to do with this? You tell me this person has a 5 millimeter nodule. What am I supposed to do? But typically it was community care. So the docs were not invested in the study, in the trial, which you could argue was good and bad, or bad, I mean. So another thing to think about.
Thank you. I think because there are other classes
and
everything.
Sure.
But as Dr. Marcus said, she's
No,
available.
it's Pam.
It's Pam.